Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Recently, the World Inequality Lab released its newest flagship study, the World Inequality Report of 2026. It's edited by Lucas Chancel, Ricardo Gomez Carrera, Rwanda Morshreff, and Thomas Piketty, the French economist that is very well known in the U.S., who is very well known in the U.S. It has a preface from Joseph Stiglitz and Jayati Ghosh. It's the product of 4 years of work, we're told, with more than 200 researchers across the lab's global network, timed alongside South Africa's G20 presidency and the G20's own Stiglitz-led inequality panel. The headline findings are blunt. Global inequality is enormous, and the report argues tax progressivity collapses exactly where it should bite the hardest. The policy ask that follows is familiar from past edition, a minimal global wealth tax paired now with a call for a standing international panel on inequality model after the one on global climate work. But underneath this report sits a much older argument, one that predates Piketty by at least 2 centuries. Is poverty reduced by redistributing what already exists, or by growing the pie so fast that even a shrinking share still means a rising standard of living? Is the wealth or income share held by the top even the right thing to measure? Or is it a distraction from what's actually happened to material living standard? That is food, shelter, health, leisure, for the people at the bottom over the last 200 years. That's the debate Piketty has now revived at least 3 times. And it's the debate we're having today. And to talk about this, I have 2 fantastic guests. The first one is Phil Magness. He holds the David Thoreau Chair of Political Economy at the Independence Institute. He's an economic historian by training. He's a PhD and an MMP from George Mason University School of Public Policy. And before being at the Independent Institute, he held the F.A. Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History at the American Institute for Economic Research, which hosts this podcast. Phil, he's a warrior on these issues, and he's just really remarkable. Another incredible, really full of energy and insights is Vincent Geloso. He's an assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. He has a PhD and master's in economics from the London School of Economics. He is Canadian. He's a French Canadian, actually. And he is also a research fellow at the Independent Institute and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. And again, a colleague at AIER. And he has an upcoming book at the Chicago University Press that I cannot wait to read on all of these issues and correcting a lot of the records then that we are hearing about. So welcome, guys.
Hello. Happy to be here.
So I want to start with a really big question. And maybe I'll start with you, Vincent. Should we care about inequality?
Yes and no. So the yes part is when people say they care about inequality, they don't really mean inequality in the way they generally understand it. By inequality, we should care about whether or not the living standards of the poor are increasing. Are they gaining in terms of living standards? Do they have access to the same opportunities as the wealthy do? But when you think about what that means, it basically is a question about income mobility. So very often when people say they care about inequality, they're confusing a lot of different things. But I don't think we should care about the outcomes being egalitarian in terms of the that incomes are well distributed or things like that. What should really care is, are people able to rise to a higher point in the income distribution regardless of where they started? And the fact of the matter is, and this is something I've been arguing for year in work that, well, not the work I'm doing with Phil, but other work on income mobility, which is that actually redistribution doesn't do much for income mobility. It does a few things, but the things that really matter for income mobility are secure property rights, which incentivize effort in the forefront by people to climb up the ladder, to encourage innovation, low taxation because it rewards efforts, rather than discourage it, and limited regulation. And at the same time, there's obviously the role of economic freedom here is that it means more opportunity, fewer barriers to move upward, but also the economic growth that comes out of economic freedom on average generally also creates entirely new pathways for ascendancy. So if you're a really poor society and you start having some growth, initially the only way you can climb up the ladder is to start working more hours in agriculture. But once a new sector comes in, maybe you could work more hours in agriculture, but you could also shift to another sector where you have a comparative advantage. And the more economic development happens, the more pathways to upward ascendancy you find. And this is why I say that ultimately, when people say they care about income inequality, they're not looking at the right thing. And they're especially not looking at the right recipes, because the right recipes are basically open markets, secure property rights, limited regulation, and on average, really fast economic growth.
Yeah, so I will want us to go back to this and really dig into this. But Phil, you're an economic historian, so I want to ask you. I mean, this income inequality. So I remember. So when I was in France, when I was a young scholar in France, I was already fighting with Thomas Piketty, literally on this issue. And what Vincent's just said about what we care is not so much the gap between the rich and the poor, but how much the poor are lifted up. I remember a conference saying that to him, and it was just kind of like, so we've been saying the same thing. But my question to you is more like the preoccupation of people like Piketty in the past, and you can go as far back for the past as you want, wasn't always inequality. It seems that actually the inequality conversation is actually something that's relatively modern. Is that the case?
I think that generally is. I look at someone like Piketty and his co-author, Sayez and Zuckman in particular. The three of them, the PSZ triumvirate, if you want to call it that, they are scholars that have a very specific set of policy prescriptions, policy objectives that they're trying to get to. And I see their work on inequality as a way to try to work backward from those prescriptions to get a reason, to get a cause. Because what do we know about inequality? Well, some of the best empirical data looks, they find generally there's no strong relationship that can be discerned between inequality and all of these social ills that supposedly come from it. There's a big meta-analysis that came out in Nature earlier this year that looked at indicators of well-being and inequality, and they basically found the empirical relationships are all either weak to non-existent after studying hundreds of analyses of these. We also have historical data. Walter Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler, he points out that yes, there are instances in the past when inequality has reduced, but he basically comes to a pretty frightening conclusions. He says that the two effective mechanisms of history that reduce or eliminate inequality are wars and depressions.
Yeah.
So physical destruction of the capital stock or economic destruction of the capital stock. Says if you want to eliminate inequality, you need bad things to happen. All of these other policies that are undertaken around the edges, at best they're ineffective. They're not really doing anything. But inequality itself seems to be kind of like the political slogan to justify a set of redistributive policies. I only really see inequality entering into the lexicon in the early 2010s. It was, a mantra of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which said we are the 99% versus they are the 1%. That was straight out of Piketty. He capitalized on that and provided it an intellectual framework. And you even see it in, if you study word use over time, inequality starts to spike really in the late 2000s, early 2010s, kind of an aftermath of the financial crisis. And these people have still been living in 2008 for the past 18 years now, which is also kind of strange. But they think that it supposedly illustrated a fundamental problem of inequality. And everything since then has been the preoccupation with a suite of policies to address inequality. And yet those policies don't actually work at addressing inequality, nor is there evidence that inequality needs addressing in the way that they're seeking.
So the past generations basically had their own Piketty and Saz and Zuckman, but they were not using inequality as a reason for those policy prescription. They were using lifting people out of poverty. They were, I assume, lifting other things. And Vincent, I remember you had with Chelsea Follett at Cato, you guys had an index. You looked at global inequality, and it was like a really, I remember writing a column about great news. Like global inequality is literally at a near all-time low in 150 years or something like this. And right. And in this, you looked at whether we should care about inequality, global inequality in general. And there was just kind of like one thing was striking to me, if I remember correctly, in this report is like you said, people don't actually really care about inequality. Like they care about whether they feel that some people are basically having access to political favors, right? Did you remember this correctly?
Yes. So this is where I'm a bit different than Phil on this. So Phil and I have been working, I want to say for a decade now on these matters. And I think I have different points of emphasis than Phil, but I end up with the same qualitative assessment of the quality of the work that Piketty, Size, and Zuckman do, but I do have a different normative take on inequality, where I think there is, but this is again goes back to my earlier comment that people very frequently don't know exactly what they mean by inequality. So there's a famous quote that I like in a paper by Finis Welch in the American Economic Review, where he says, inequality is destructive. And I'm quoting here. I had to go and look it up exactly as you were asking me the question. It says inequality is destructive whenever the low wage citizenry views society as unfair, when it views effort as not worthwhile, or when upward mobility is viewed as impossible or as so unlikely that its pursuit is not worthwhile. And in that quote, I think it says everything about what people are confusing. Is they're thinking of inequality. The part that disturbs people about inequality is the fact that people with merits, skills, abilities cannot seize and develop their skills or what they perceive as things they can do. That's what really offends us. It's not the inequality per se. The problem, I think that's the problem more of a critique now with Piketty and Saez and Zuckman is they often reverse engineer explications that they find upon their finding. So, for example, one of the big concepts that's really popular in income mobility is the Great Gatsby curve. And it proposes a relationship where societies with high inequality are going to be societies with low income mobility across generations. So, if your parent is born at the 10th centile, then you're going to be at the 10th centile as a perfectly immobile society, even though society could grow between the two generations. And they say, well, that's to prove that inequality hurts. And the mechanism they have for this is the rich can access opportunities more than the poor can. So basically, some things are locked away from the meritorious poor, if you want in a certain way. But the problem is that's not what they're saying. Is they're reverse, they're taking this thing and then they're sticking it to their findings and arguing for the policy remedies. And they never go to the other things that really do matter. Because if what we're offended about is the fact that some people cannot rise along the income ladder because they have innate skills, but they just can't develop them for some reason. The reality is inequality across generation, income inequality. The more you try and account for the role of the rule of law, of economic freedom, the security of property rights, the less and less the level of inequality matters in society to income mobility.
So what you're
So
what you're saying is like the more economic freedom we have, the less we face with these problem
exactly.
of inequality. So basically, like So if you have a world where there's more economic freedom, you're going to see less potential wasted and more potential able to actually like use their ability and then go up the income ladder, right? Is that
Yes, and yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying, and there's 2 mechanisms for this, and then I'll give you a real world example where I had to look for something that could capture people's understanding of the point by looking for a microcosm, and I found one, and I'll explain it. But the point we pointed out is it's not just that there's an absence of legal barriers, because if there's occupational licensing, so I have the right to I have to buy a permit to be a hairdresser. Not a problem for me as I'm bald, but for most people, that would be like a barrier, a legal barrier to mobility. That's the direct barriers, but there's indirect barriers that economic freedom destroys to mobility. Societies that have economic growth have more specialization. Specialization means more pathways to upward ascendancy. That means that there's more ways for you to climb up the ladder. So that's one of the other things we observe is societies that have higher GDP per capita also have higher income mobility, regardless of how you look at it. And even the societies that have that are seen as like sometimes low mobility, it's because the way we calculate the data, we rarely account for like immigration. So in the United States, if you account for the income, the United States has really high income mobility. And that's before accounting for the fact that a Canadian who moves across the border, and a Canadian's not a poor person, but moves across the border, he's basically the equivalent of having jumped from the median to the top decile just by having moved the border. So it's insane the differences you can capture just by this. But essentially, that these open economies, when they have limited legal barriers, will have more income mobility. And because they also promote growth, they create more pathways for people to rise up. And the way I want to point it out to people is I actually looked at an example where people would understand what the hell I'm trying to say, and it's the Olympics. So I'll elaborate just a bit. Is the Olympics is a perfect
it
example
would
of
have
this.
been
So
better if you had a World Cup example, but we'll take the
I
Olympics.
yeah, we'll go for the Olympics because Canada doesn't compete that much into the World Cup, so it's just occasional that it happens. So I'm Canadian, so that's why I do this. I'm actually one of the French Canadians. I'm a Frenchie who understands the other Frenchie, but the Frenchies don't consider me a Frenchie. We're basically for them, we're the equivalent of a Southern person in the United States to the rest of the English speaking world. So we're basically like Appalachia people to them, and I do lean into that stereotype. But the role of the Olympics here is interesting because the people who are good at high performance sports do have an innate talent. And we can say that this is somewhat randomly distributed with respect to income. So here you will have meritorious poor. But this is where the Piketty argument and others would point in is say something like, well, the innately talented poor in high inequality society will not be able to invest in these talents, hone them, practice them, get them to higher level performance. So you will find it in societies where there's high inequality, the innately talented poor cannot compete in the highest performance sports, the Olympics. And so you'll find that in these societies, you don't have enough. The athletes that go to the Olympics are those who had the resources and were innately talented. And you do find that there's a relation between inequality and winning medals because countries that have low inequality seem to be able to send better athletes. However, that relationship is entirely conditional on do you come from a country with shitty institutions? In the group of nations that have strong property rights, that have low taxation, that have low regulation, you find none of that relationship. The relationship for economically free country, there's no relation between winning medals and and the level of income inequality. And the reason here actually shows the reason why we shouldn't care about inequality in free society and in free markets. Because an athlete who's innately talented, someone who spots him, either as an advertiser, either as a coach, either as a charity, there's this series of mechanisms where there are rewards for people of investing in other people to develop these skills, because then this becomes value to third parties. So if there's a great hockey player and you realize he's a poor hockey player and you're a charity group or even just like a talent coach, Well, you realize that you'll make a fortune yourself by developing his talent and making him available for the NHL. You've made for a better society this way. And here you're capturing why when I say that it's not inequality that matters to income mobility and free society, it is the institutions that we have that say we want equality of permission for people to try, and that creates a really powerful ecosystem of ways to convey resources to those who can create values to others regardless of where they come from. So when I said, and this goes, finally I can circle back, when Piketty, Saez, Zuckman bring in these explanations, they're just trying to impose a relationship, an empirical regularity into something they already wanted without seeing the other empirical statement that's in there that no, this relationship only exists in places that have horrible, horrible institutions. In places where there's good institutions, the effect of income mobility on the effect of income inequality on mobility is far weaker, if not entirely irrelevant.
Yeah, I also want to kind of actually ask you about Raz Chetty because while he's a more respectable in my book person than Piketty, Saz and Zuckman because those guys are so ideological and they just actually and then we can actually talk about the stuff that they've done with their data, which is really shameful and that you guys have exposed. But I mean, not just like the shady stuff, but also actually they're going about it the wrong way. They're measuring the wrong thing. So I want us to cover this. But you take a Rash Chetty, right? And he too ascribe a lot of problems that we have, including the decrease in growth, to rise in inequality. There's actually the kind of the problem in actually kind of understanding the consequences or non-consequences or like the factors in which inequality may matter. It's like it's not just proper to those socialist, I would say. A guy like Chetty, like, says a lot of that stuff, right?
So I don't know, again, I don't wanna speak for Phil because even though Phil and I have very strong alignment on a lot of things, I don't think we've discussed this in detail, the mobility stuff. But I would say that I actually see myself as building upon Chetty in contrast to what I'm doing with the Piketty stuff, which is saying that their work needs to be substituted. Whereas I'm seeing that what I'm doing is providing a richer complement to Chetty. I do think it's the opposite with Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman is their work is,
Oh,
and if
yeah,
we want
I'm
to
not
get into this,
comparing. I'm not comparing
Right,
them.
right.
One
no,
I
no, no,
am
but that allows me to say the point about Chetty is he started this literature. Well, I wouldn't say he started, but he made huge advances via measurements.
Right,
And
right.
once he did the measurements, at the same time, he looked at these more structural, or if you want to say sociological determinants of income mobility. And just by virtue of the fact that at one point you can't do all the contributions at once, he looked at these things and he went a particular pathways after creating his measurement of income mobility across generations. Then he got into some debates about what's the ideal measurement. And he's been very honest, very transparent. I really like his work. But I actually just said, okay, let's forget the measurements debate for this one. Let's look at the other variables. Like, what's the role of economic policy? So I have like a slew of papers with Justin Calais and Alicia Plemons and Gary Wagner where we look at what's the role of economic freedom, either across countries, within countries, and and increasing income mobility. And what we find is generally economic freedom in a horse race matters just as much, if not so much more than income inequality. So that these structural factors that in the Chetty way of viewing the world are like kind of inherited and things that agents can only play in if there's like huge, strong government interventions to change the structure of families, to change how people live in certain places, to change the way schooling is done in the non-school choice kind of way. We were saying, no, look, even just like open markets and limited regulation on labor markets and strong property rights will make it that these structural factors are not going to be as deterministic as you actually think they are. So that's why I say I see Chetty as genuinely serious and just engage in a particular pathway. And because time is limited, he's just keep going in that route. Whereas I do see more sloppiness in the Piketty size Zuckman slants, where there I think the quality of the work leaves much to be desired.
Hmm. Phil?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I mean, I think Chetty's work is interesting. I don't think it's necessary to the study of inequality, but it does complement and provide some data background for things that others have intuited. But yeah, I draw a very clear line between him and Piketty Sayers Zuckman.
There's no
And
comparison.
yeah, there's no comparison. I mean, in Zuckman in particular, I think has breached the ethical boundaries of responsible research.
Yeah, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about this. When Piketty wrote a book in, and it was 2019, 2014, sorry, Capital in the 21st Century, is that the one?
Yep,
And there's no other way to say this, but he was he was greeted as a rock star here in
absolutely.
the
Yeah.
US, like literally, I mean, a rock star, which I won't lie, even before reading the book, which I will be honest, I've read part of it only. It was harder for me to stomach than I was horrified just because of my experience with Piketty in France. And I know, Vincent, that you've said that some of his work from the 90s are actually really worth it. Like he's not only done horrible things. I think there's a 95 article or 1995 article that is actually very decent. But I was, like, horrified, and he was greeted with, like, the most kind of, like, yeah, rock star status. It's like everyone took for granted that somehow what he had written was not only different, but it was just, like, the truth. He did a US tour, met with a who's who. He got, like, the best reviews, and it was I wrote a piece with Tyler Cowen at the time in the New York Times, and we were critical, but at the time it was like bold to be critical about
Yes.
some of his stuff. Like we're like one of the things has I think has been established since is like kind of like when you look at the way he measures housing, like assets and all that you have like a you already have a big problem. But you guys, like ever since that time, I've actually kind of looked really, really deeply in all of this data. And because he's collaborated with Zuckman and Sass, we should say those two, they're in California, they're at Berkeley.
Yep.
Even Zuckman is actually kind of really involved. He continued to try to destroy France as much as he can. He has a Zuckman tax and all
Well,
this.
I don't think France need his help.
No, no, France doesn't need precisely because
He's an accelerant.
these guys fit in so well in France. Like people don't kind of question them. They're treated like rock star there, even though there's some pushing back finally. But anyway, so can you give us a little history of basically like what's wrong? What's wrong with Piketty's work,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
also
I'll start with something about theory, and I'll let Phil talk about more about the data because Phil is the one that really did a lot of the historical research, and then like because he knew tax history so well and really found extra details that then with my theoretical knowledge we could use the two to point out that there's a lot of sloppiness. But of the 2014 book, there were two parts to that book. The first part was the theory that capital, the wealth, the dynastic wealth would always increase more than the economy grows. And so you would inevitably have a situation where the wealthy would own everything. I'm oversimplifying, but that's essentially it. That part got destroyed within 6 months. None of that has survived. So
Mhm.
the entire econ profession has abandoned this. And the big killing stone was what you mentioned with housing capital, where just empirically it doesn't hold. All of the relationship that he was discussing was driven by the fact that because governments have regulated housing so much more, the supply of housing has fallen, the value of housing capital went up, and it has nothing to do with like some inherent law of capitalism as he was intending. The part that survived longer, and this is where Phil started with Bob Murphy initially, then I came along, and it's the measurement. That one had a much longer half life and needed far more efforts to dig true sources to go true. And I think this is where Phil definitely has like far more to say. And I think here I'm going to be too nice if I'm the one saying this, because
Right.
of the two, I'm the one who's the I tend to try to be nice, and I think Phil has, however, the right approach to not be nice
I,
here
I will
because
I
there
will
is yeah.
I will before I turn to Phil and Phil, go all out. I just want to say that you're totally right because the thing that was interesting is like at the time where we wrote our piece, right? It was right in the middle where he was in the country and he was being a rock star. And the reason why I knew about the housing stuff is because I actually had read stuff in French about it. They were actually and in France, no one was talking about this, right? And his audience was really the US because ultimately I'd like to know like later what you think of my theories. Like, I think ultimately these guys' target is the US. That's who they want to see less rich. Like that's that there. So this is why Piketty like is like
I'm
I
not
think
sure I'd say that, but I do think that there is something that irritated me early on in the project is because I speak French and I read French. I could see that they're not saying the same thing in France a year before than they are in English later. They were far more moderate in English and said things very differently in English than in French. I remember Piketty saying something in French like "Les marchés vont toujours générer une inégalité." It will always create more inequality, and markets were bad. He was saying stuff like that in French, like very strongly as
yeah, but I
2007.
mean he also they're smart. They know that there's stuff they can't say.
E which is a sign for me that there was something that really was irksome, but then in English, they would go on Tyler Cohen's show and say to Tyler something like, "Well, I think markets are great, and we should have markets, but we need to also curtail the downsides of
Yeah,
market."
yeah.
So, the fact that I was getting 2 versions, and if you read me in French and English, because I write a lot in French too, I get this I say the same thing in both languages with the
Yeah,
same amount
same.
of cussing, by the way. Uh,
Can verify that.
uh but I don't vary it. The fact that they varied was a sign for me that something was off, and this is probably the best place to let Phil go
Yeah.
on to it.
But I mean, what I was going to say is like it was very true that within 6 months, you're right that the housing stuff became just totally well known. So Phil, take it away.
Yeah, so when this book is published in 2014, the big praise that it kept getting, people would say, "Okay, maybe the theory is a little bit off and has some weird prescriptive ends, but Piketty has impeccable data." He brought all these mounds of statistics to bear, and they prove that regardless of whether you accept his proposals as conclusions, inequality nonetheless is empirically demonstrated, it exists, and it's a problem. And I'm sitting here, I'm an economic historian by background. I study the early income tax system in the United States. So I had worked in some of the same data that he had worked in. And I start reading this thing, and the numbers are just not adding up. They're not lining up with basic events of economic history that I knew. So I started digging deeper into his empirics. And what it comes down to is at the end of the day, his book was not replicable. You could go and follow the exact sources he would cite and attempt to redo what he claimed to have done with them, and you get very different results. So I actually did this. I got a paper where I looked at his numbers for the UK as a much more simple, focused, compact version because the US numbers are very complex, but the UK came from a single source. It's a smaller country. And I trace back to the beginning where he said he got his numbers from, did all the procedures he said he did to them, and I get two divergent patterns, especially in the last 40 years, so about 1980 to the present, where he says wealth concentrations are rising. The data that I analyzed and replicated his material with actually show it's flat. So I start looking into this and I'm thinking, something is just not right here. Every time Piketty comes to an opportunity to make a discretionary decision to either fill a gap in the data or explain something that's not quite directly apparent in the numbers that he has. He would make that discretionary call in one direction. And that direction was always to augment inequality, augment the patterns that he is showing. So that tells me he's not a neutral, objective scientific researcher. Ends up being the case that his data are one of the weakest parts of his arguments. He is almost always trying to show increasing trends of inequality, whether in income and wealth in recent decades, that are not apparent in the raw material he is using for data and are certainly not apparent in alternative metrics. So Vincent and I, one of the things we did is we took his United States series, which covers from about the start of the income tax system in the 1910s all the way up to the present day, and uses that as a measure to see where top income concentration has gone over the course of the last century. And of course, he has a very strong political causal narrative to why this is the case. He says we start with very high inequality in the kind of the tail end of the Gilded Age, the Roaring Twenties, and then he argues that it's actually over the course of the mid 20th century extremely high top marginal income tax rates are put in place. They kind of start with Herbert Hoover, they really accelerate under FDR, and they become a permanent fixture in the mid 20th century. And he has it right down to the year, right down to the exact moment he claims that there's like an inflection or a turn in income concentration, he says, coincides with FDR jacking up the top marginal tax rate, using taxes to redistribute away from the top, hold the constitution of the capital stock at the top down through the tax mechanism. And he says, well, this lasts across the 20th century until the Reagan era, and then they start cutting income tax rates, especially at the top of the distribution. And that is the mechanism that causes inequality to rebound. So he has a very nice, tightly argued narrative of political causality tied to the data. And we started digging into the data, and it turns out that there are several compounded problems here. The first one is what I already mentioned. He puts his thumb on the scale and makes every single discretionary call he can in the direction of augmenting inequality. The second, they really don't understand or follow the trajectory of early US tax law. So we go back to the original numbers. We found multiple instances of everything from basic typos to they did not realize that certain categories were exempted from taxation in the 1920s and 30s that are no longer the case. They didn't realize that there are major overhauls in the way that tax data are reported and collected. They didn't realize certain effects of World War II, like soldiers in combat zones get their paychecks exempted from income taxation. Just dozens of these little details and nuances of history. And it turns out if you go back in and account for these specific details, it greatly alters the depicted U curve of inequality, especially in that early part of the century. It also alters it on the rebound that they are supposedly showing from 1980 to the present. So what we did is we applied a very thorough set of corrections to them, starting with 1917 through about the 1960s. And we found that their numerator, how they're measuring top income concentration, has multiple instances where they're just missing income, or other instances where they're over-reporting income. And it all seems to create a distorted picture at the top. So we apply those corrections. We find out their denominator, they're mismeasuring the total figure for personal income reporting in the United States in those years. And in fact, use some very shady, like back of the envelope adjustments from national accounts when they should have actually been accounting with national accounts. So we went back through and we redid the numbers, and the
They
instant.
I would add, they actually it's even a bit worse than that. They just apply a raw number.
Yeah, it's a raw multiplier.
They just say, "We'll take 80% of personal income after transfers."
Yeah.
And they don't say where they get that 80%. They say they tried some average. The average doesn't even match in their own data. It's just like it's when I used the word sloppy earlier, it's that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
they did stuff like this that's really, really irksome.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we're focused on a precision data story and data is supposed to be what's driving the theory, this is a problem. But the gist of it is we redo the numbers for the United States, and it flattens out the two tails of the U curve. Inequality is actually quite a bit lower in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. It actually levels out because of the Great Depression even further. It's not the tax mechanism, it's the stock market crash and aftermath that are the leveling effects. And then the rebound since 1980 to the present is also much more tepid than they are showing because they have made data decisions that accelerate inequality. So we published several studies on this, revising their numbers, redoing their numbers, including in some very decent journals. I mean, I'll tout our own ability to place this. So it's been peer reviewed and vetted. We have better numbers than they do. And yet they proceed undeterred as if those original calculations they had made, complete with all the errors, even if they'll concede the errors were made, all of their current edifice of research is built entirely on top of that. And that's just the
I would
core
add
pity.
something for I would add something to this is sometimes they also do something where they change their series and they don't leave details for us
Right.
to understand what the changes are. So that was something that we had a hard time reverse engineering the data. But in something that Phil said that I want to emphasize that's I think really important is I think it's normal that humans do errors.
Sure, sure.
But the pattern of errors, forget the size of the errors, the pattern of errors, if you just think about plus or minus, the pattern should amount to a zero.
Yeah.
Sometime a plus, sometime a minus, then a plus, then a minus. You should have no predictable pattern. Of in total, in the articles that me and Phil did together and three others that I did by myself, there's technically 27 different types of errors. And for 25 of them,
It's all in the
it
same
goes the
direction.
way of pushing inequality up, and by very sizable amounts. And at that point, I mean, I get that luck happens, someone wins the lottery every time, but you can't do 25 errors that advantage you in a row and then do only 2 that disadvantage you. I think this is more of an indication that the work is sloppy and maybe they never question what they got. Whereas, and I will add this extra thing, is Phil and I have found stuff that, I mean, as a classical liberal, because I am one, I like. But I also found results in our work that as a classical liberal, I don't like. I wish it was less convenient. But it's not. I don't. Convenience shouldn't be a factor here. Ideological convenience should not be a factor. I think that's the part that we should note from how Phil is presenting the stuff is most of the errors tend to go in ways that make their case far easier to sustain because they just need to say, look, inequality is going up and it's nearly as high as the 1920s, and thus we need aggressive taxation. And no, no, when you do the data right, there's nothing close to being
Yeah.
able to sustain that
Right, right.
with any degree of certainty.
Well, let me ask you something because it's the word error. Like, okay, so they're sloppy. They're sloppy. I'm trying to be as nice as you are, Vincent. They're sloppy. And I what is wrong with our profession, with the media world, with like just kind of politicians and everyone that they don't care because it's not as if they don't care about sloppiness always. Let's just remember Reinhardt and Rogoff spreadsheet issue about how in their work about how debt is dragging down growth, right? This is they wrote this paper. It was a big deal. They found an error. Actually, there are like 40 different papers since then that have actually established that relationship again. But it doesn't matter because ultimately all that people remember is that there was an error in the spreadsheet and that hence, you know, maybe that had no impact wasn't dragging on growth, right? What is it? And are you guys getting through is the next question. So
Yeah,
why
yeah.
is it that people seems to be totally immune to these types of errors? And are you guys getting through? Are you feeling you're making a progress in getting through to
Yeah, yeah. Well, and this is an area where I will be very mean to Zuckman in particular. I think he is actually a data charlatan. I think he is actually engaged in willful manipulation that goes beyond sloppiness, that goes beyond errors, and I can pretty much prove that. One of the things that Zuckman has picked up upon is if you are telling a certain story or a narrative with the data, the U.S. media will just slop it up. They love it. He has figured out that he can do peer review by way of the opinion page on the New York Times, and not run things through journals where they would be caught or at least given some sort of pushback and scrutiny. He puts out data sets that are novel, and rather than test them among his peers, he takes them to friendly journalists and opinion journalists in particular. He did this, and probably the most notable case, this is 2019. He went to the New York Times and gave David Leonhardt, one of their opinion journalists, access to new numbers that made this ostentatious claim. And the claim was that billionaires in the United States now face a lower effective tax rate than the bottom 20%. And he claimed to show the numbers. He said, well, the effective tax rate on billionaires is 23% on all federal, state, and local taxes. And then he goes through some other statistics and says, well, poor people pay an effective tax rate of 24%. And he's saying, this is proof of the inequality crisis. It's finally manifested in our tax code. And of course, the New York Times runs with it. Then the Washington Post picks it up. And all these left wing journalists, it's like validation of everything that you wanted to say. And yet this claim, I see it appearing in the New York Times and being touted all over the news. The numbers did not pass the smell test because I've been working in some of the same area, again, looking at income tax history. And I remembered something was just nagging in the back of my head that Zuckman, just a year earlier, he had published this paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics with Sayez and Piketty. And in one of the indices of these papers, it had effective tax rates on the top 0.001%, which is multimillionaires and billionaires. So about as high as you can measure. And the effective tax rate that he reported in that appendix file that I downloaded off of the internet when his new paper came out in 2018 was 41%, not 23% as he was now claiming. So I'm sitting here thinking, well, what's going on in the New York Times? And I remembered I had downloaded that old file and I pulled it up and I compared them side by side. And you found two completely different sets of numbers. The older one from 2018 that had gone through peer review looked kind of reasonable. 41% is about the same territory that most other estimates of wealthy tax burdens arrive at. And yet he's claiming 23% in the New York Times. So I put an image of these side by side, copied it, plastered it on Twitter, and I didn't even attack him. I said, what's going on here? His own data undermine what he's telling the New York Times at the moment. And of course, that goes viral. And then over the course of the next couple of days, we come to find out he has removed the data package from that 2018 paper from his personal website. Just gone down the memory hole, it disappeared, and he's replaced it with this new revised number that now aligns with the story he's telling the New York Times. So, this is a published paper in a top econ journal. You do not modify and alter your results after publication and try to hide them from the public. So he kind of gets shamed into restoring the old numbers side by side, but then he goes and backfills an explanation for why they changed. And again, it's no longer just putting the thumb on the scale through discretionary decisions, it's actively making discretionary decisions to get the political story that he wants to tell. So the two big ones that come out of his revisions is you find he alters the way that corporate tax incidence is applied. Best evidence that we have from the econ literature, corporate tax incidence is kind of like tariff incidence. It doesn't just affect the person that pays the corporate tax rate, the corporation itself. It actually distributes across onto the workers of that corporation. There are market effects over prices that are affected by corporate taxation. Very vast literature on corporate tax incidence. And what it basically comes down to is if you're trying to measure this thing, you have to come up with a formula to distribute it across all the affected parties. Zuckman says, no, we're only going to assume corporate tax incidence falls on the shareholders. The shareholders concentrate among the wealthy because they own the largest share of stock. Well, corporate tax rates have generally declined in the US from the 1960s to the present. So when you do that, you build that into an overall measure of tax incidence, you are biasing the record that you're keeping of the wealthiest earners downward over time. And you can actually see this in comparing the two charts before and after this manipulation side by side. And what you get is a very conventional chart in the 2018 paper, a very unconventional yet politically ostentatious progressive tax claim in the 2019 release to the New York Times. As Zuckman comes under fire for this, but he was telling the story that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and the wealth tax people in California all wanted to hear. And now that's become the talking point with no scrutiny, even though we can absolutely prove that this is a result of manipulated data.
Yeah, no, I mean it's really disheartening. So are you okay? You guys have been machines. You've been like you have tackled in a very very, very scholarly way, every single aspect of this. Vincent, you have a book coming out on this. You
Yeah.
wanna you wanna
Yeah.
talk about this a little bit? And just also with kind of like this question in the back of your mind, like, do you think you guys are getting through to people?
Yeah, so I was gonna answer that part first. So I'm probably less pessimistic than Phil is here, largely because and probably less than you also, because w I tend to think as an economist, which means at the margin, there is no way I was gonna convince Piketty, Saez, Zuckman,
Well, I
or
mean,
people
I
or
don't hear these guys.
yeah, but I'm thinking of them as being part of the furthest away margin from where I am.
Mhm.
So what I was thinking is, who's the next person that I can reasonably talk to and who's open-minded? And every time I've had a conversation on this with people who were open-minded, it has gone my way and my and Phil's way. So I do think there's been progress. Our work gets a decent amount of citation.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
see you cited I see you retweeted by far and wide,
Yeah, yeah.
by actually people even in the center left. I've seen you guys mentioned even by Matt Iglesias. I mean, like, I see you, you know, I
yeah,
see you.
That's the
that's my
audience,
test.
yeah, yeah, that's
That's
one we
my
can
test
convert.
for whether or not we've had an impact, is people who are open to discussion. Once we present them with the evidence, we can come to we actually win the ground on this. And by the way, I wanna notice, and then I'll say the part about the book, and it will explain what's happening between in terms of research as well, is the true pattern of inequality. So theirs is like a very pronounced U curve.
Yeah,
So it
yeah.
starts high, stays high, and then collapses in World War II when taxes are introduced, when higher taxes are introduced and withholding is introduced. Then there's a golden age of inequality, a really low trough to the U, and then it goes back up because something Reagan. But what we find is a pattern that's looks like a U curve, but a very different U. And we call it the T saucer because it starts a bit higher than it got in the middle, like a tea saucer is, and it ends up a bit higher. But tea saucers look more like flat than a small decline, but not necessarily flat, like just a small declination, and then a small acceleration, then a low trough, and then a small acceleration, and then a new like low levels. And that actually looks like pretty much the correct pattern, where inequality in like 1929 is definitely higher than inequality in 1955, and inequality in 1955 is definitely less than inequality in 1999. That's it. That's what we can say. It doesn't say anything anti-leftist. You can still think that inequality is too high with our corrected numbers. This is something I keep pointing out. You can hold the same normative standing of what you think about policy and still buy our numbers. It's just you have to go through the extra effort of telling us what's the right level of inequality that you want to target. It's not invalidating any position. And when I'm able to say that to people, this is just a numbers game, people are convinced. Now, on to the question you're asking about the book. Phil and I, once we finished those things, it was like, where are we going next? And Phil was more interested in the wealth inequality stuff, so he's the one definitely on the wealth. But I wanted to keep doing income inequality. So I kept looking at what are the other adjustments that we should normally do to data. Should we consider the cost of living if inflation is not the same for the rich and poor? What's the data qual what's the data quality a century before? Or what's the method that we use to convert the data into a usable measure of inequality? And gradually, as I was doing them, it changed sometimes the level of inequality up, sometimes down, sometimes it changed the trend. But once you collected all the modifications, you realize that there's something that people don't understand. And it's really important. The period 1870 to 1910 in the US is a period where economic growth for the poor is massively underestimated because of the problems, for example, with census data. The poor are missing from the data. The improvements are massively understated. And they're, once you get the correct data in, they're as fast as the top 1%. So the argument that's building in the book is, I wanted to call it the first egalitarian enrichment. The editor didn't like it. They made me go on the great enrichment to refer to Deidre McCluskey. But the point is, in America, in the era of supposed free markets, America was a lean and mean egalitarian growth machine. The living standards for the bottom people went up as fast as the top 1%. And this was the first time it happened in human history that growth was pretty much the same across the income ladder and that it was as fast. And so the argument of the book is essentially saying the even the narratives that they're weaving is wrong. So this is more than just the numbers game. This is the interpretation is wrong. The true story of what fights inequality goes back to my opening statements is in an economy with open markets, with the ability to contest incumbent firms, the ability to secure your property rights, that if you make investment in a business or in trying some innovation, you reap the rewards of these efforts. What you will find is that this economy will have a super fast growth, but it will be very strong, so much so that you can't tell if there's differences between the rich and the poor and the pace at which they're improving. So what we end up finding is in the book is America is a more egalitarian place by the end of the Gilded Age than it was at the beginning of the Gilded Age. And it's the if you want to think about it, it's the anti-Piketty and the anti-Zuckman and its argument is that no, what we don't need to tax things to have a fairer society where the living standards of all are improving, especially those at the bottom. It's what you need is open markets, you need secure property rights, and the only tragedy of the period is that some people didn't have the same legal rights as other, referring to African Americans, and that tells you that that machine was so powerful that despite that one part of blatant violations of economic freedoms, it was still able to generate that first egalitarian enrichment. It tells you it's probably the strongest case for markets are inherently egalitarian forces. They give more opportunity, they matter more for poor people than they matter to rich people. And that's why I think this book, even though I don't want to make it about Piketty, Size, and Zuckman, it is the anti-dem in that I am saying no. The true story is markets are the most egalitarian force that mankind has ever been able to harness.
And this is also the ultimate great tragedy of all of those people who still live in extreme poverty in the world. That ultimately the people that the World Inequality Lab is trying to help by lifting them up with extreme redistribution is that actually what is really keeping these people in poverty is that they're actually not growing,
Yeah.
and that even if we had minimal, I mean, I was shocked this week. You were very nice, Vincent, to look at my column to make sure that I wasn't saying something that wasn't wrong. But like I was shocked to realize that Madagascar, DR Congo, all these countries had literally not grown in 75 years. It's like it was kind of crazy. And the reason is not that we haven't actually redistributed a ton of money and a ton of aid, is that we haven't had any growth in these countries. And the reason why we haven't had any growth, it's because they don't have they don't have economic freedom. They don't have they don't have institutions that protect property rights. They don't have the rule of law. They don't have if markets. They don't have any of this, right?
Yeah, that would be my I would agree with that, but I would add the extra thing that it's not just that, and this is something that I find very frequent as a misconception that people have, is they tend to think of economic freedom as an on and off switch. You either have it or you don't. But the reality is the longer the switch is on, and you probably more the more you've dialed to the maximum, the more it matters. Because there's accumulation of the fruits of economic freedom. So when I said at the beginning, if I'm free to specialize in whichever way I want, then that means that people have incentives on entrepreneurship to create new specialization, to be of service to others in ways that profit them. And so you keep creating new and new pathways. So nations that have had not just high level of economic freedom, but high levels of economic freedom for a very long time will have situations where income mobility is greatest, where the poor can rise up according to their skills, where people have incentives to invest in them, where we don't really care if there's positive externalities to our innovation because the property rights are so secure that even if I get 1% of a massive innovation, that 1% is so secure that it's still sufficient for me to undergo the innovative effort. And so this point that I'm making is that you end up with societies that, because they have a long history of allowing people equality of permission to try things, you will have a society that has more income mobility. And the the Piketty argument, the Saez argument, the Zuckman argument, but also since both you and I are French, Bourdieu or Foucault and everyone like this who's like, unfortunately, the French philosophers who have talked about this, they don't understand the key point that any structural inequality that exists at a point in time that create legation of inequality, inheritance of inequality from parents to kids, these can be destroyed by markets. Markets are the most egalitarian force, and they keep getting stronger the more you let them operate over time. They have this great memory process where they can generate more and more destruction of structural barriers to what we could call a more ideal society, where it's not just that there's anyone can jump along the ladder. The poor can go from rags to riches. The rich don't stay rich as the top 1% forever. They can regress towards the mean, but everybody goes up technically, where there's absolute and relative mobility. This is what markets give us, this ability to create societies that have strong absolute and relative mobility.
Well, this is a great place to end. But I want to first thank you for this conversation, but I also want to thank you both for the work that you do, because it's essential, and it is, it is, if it weren't for people like you, and there are a few others, but if it weren't for people like you, we wouldn't stand a shot at winning this fight. So thank you so much, guys.
I will add one thing, and this is a joke I keep telling Phil, and it's a rule everyone should follow. Every time I start something with Phil, I tell Phil, I think you're wrong. And then 6 weeks later, I have to say, Phil, you were right. So when Phil says something, forget your initial reflex. And I still haven't learned that lesson. But when
Yeah, you
Phil
still
says
fight me.
something, it's
Well,
We go through the motions.
I don't have at all. That's just maybe like the one thing where I'm like, I'm better than you, Vincent.
maybe,
Whereas,
but
like, I have learned a long time ago that when Phil says something, Phil's right.
yes, but that's the point I want people to learn is Phil rarely gets it wrong.
Yeah. So, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.